Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you the chess match between Kasparov and Topalov that occurred in 1999 in the Netherlands. This match is known as Kasparov's Immortal Game. In this game, Kasparov is playing the white pieces and Topalov is playing the black pieces. Kasparov decided to start off with e4. Topalov went with the d6. Kasparov decided to go with d4, trying to control the center. Topalov decided to go with knight to f6, trying to target the e4 pawn. Kasparov decided to move his knight to c3 to protect the e4 pawn. Topalov decided to move his pawn to g6, trying to fiend shadow his bishop to g7. Kasparov moved his bishop to e3, and then Topalov decided to move his bishop to g7. Kasparov moved his queen up to d2, putting his queen and his bishop in the same diagonal and making room for his king to castle on the queen side. Topalov decided to try and counter by moving his pawn to c6, and then Kasparov decided to move his pawn to f3, limiting the amount of squares that Topalov's light square bishop can move to. Topalov decided to move his pawn to b5, trying to start an attack on the queen side, since he knows that Kasparov's king is probably going to castle on the queen side. Kasparov decided to move his knight to g2, since he knows that he can move it to f3. Topalov decides to move his knight to d7 for pretty much the same reason. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to h6, trying to take out the dark square bishop, and Topalov has no choice, and so the dark square bishops are exchanged. And then Topalov decides to fiend shadow his light square bishop, this time by moving it to b7. Kasparov decides to move his pawn up to a3 to prevent the little pawn push to b4, which would make Kasparov move his knight. Topalov decided to move his pawn to e5, and then Kasparov decided to castle on the queen side. Topalov decided to move his queen to e7. It looks like Topalov now wants to castle on the queen side, since he can't castle on the king side. Kasparov decided to move his king to b1 to prevent any sort of checks and or forks maybe in the future. Topalov decided to move his pawn up to a6. Kasparov decided to move his knight to c1, trying to put it in a better position later on in the game, and then Topalov decided to castle on the queen side. Kasparov decided to move his knight to b3, starting some sort of an attack on the queen side. And Topalov decided to take the pawn on d4. Kasparov decided to counter by taking the pawn with his rook. And then Topalov decided to push his pawn down, limiting the amount of squares that Kasparov's knight can go to, and also attacking the rook at the same time. Kasparov decided to just simply move his rook down, and then Topalov decided to move his knight to b6, trying to get it to attack the queen side as well. Kasparov decided to move his pawn to g3, trying to give his light square bishop some more places to go, and also wanting to move his light square bishop to h3 to try and check the king. To prevent this from happening, Topalov decided to move his king to b8. And then Kasparov moved his knight to a5, preventing Topalov from pushing his pawn down and also targeting the light square bishop at the same time. Topalov decided to move his light square bishop down to protect it, and then Kasparov decided to move his bishop all the way to h3, giving it this really long diagonal for it to attack. Topalov decided to move his pawn to d5, trying to target this little pawn chain and give his light square bishop some more room to attack. Kasparov decided to move his queen to f4 and check the king. Topalov decided to move his king to a7, and then Kasparov decided to move his rook to e1, trying to control the center. Topalov decided to move his pawn down to d4 to kick out this knight, and also to continue his attack on the queen side. Kasparov decided to move his knight to d5, trying to get it out of harm's way. And then Topalov decided to take the knight, and then Kasparov took back using the pawn, and also this not only takes the knight, but it also allows the rook to target the queen. So now Topalov can't simply just take back the pawn. So Topalov decided to move his queen to d6. Here Kasparov decided to sacrifice his rook, and Topalov accepted, and now you'll see why. Kasparov moved his rook all the way down to e7, and the reason why Topalov can't just take back with his queen is because Kasparov will take the pawn on d4 and then just start checking Topalov's king all over the board. Topalov decided to move his king to b6 to try and threaten to take his knight, Kasparov's knight. Kasparov decided instead to just sacrifice the knight as well, so he checked the king. Topalov took the knight on a5, and then Kasparov decided to try and check Topalov by pushing his pawn to b4. Topalov had to move his king down to a4, that was the only square he had, and then Kasparov moved his queen down to c3 to try and checkmate on b3. Topalov tried to prevent it by moving his queen down to d5. Kasparov decided to move his rook to a7, threatening another checkmate. Topalov had no choice but to move his bishop to b7 to try and protect the pawn. Kasparov simply took the bishop. He can't take the rook. Topalov can't take the rook, because if he did, then it would be checkmate by moving the queen to b3. So instead, Topalov decided to move his queen down to c4. He wants to try and exchange off these queens so that Kasparov can't get a checkmate. Kasparov decided to take the knight on f6, trying to gain back some of the material that he lost, which this is kind of a dangerous move since now it leaves his king sort of vulnerable and open. Topalov takes advantage of this by taking the pawn on a3. And then Kasparov decides to counter by taking the pawn on a6, checking the king and putting Topalov's king in a very vulnerable position. Topalov decides to try to counter by taking the pawn on a4. It was also the only move that he had. Oh wait, sorry, I meant the pawn on b4, not a4. Kasparov decides to check Topalov's king by moving his pawn up. Topalov decides instead of taking with the queen, he's going to take with the king. Kasparov this time decides to try and do a really long check with his queen to a1, checking the king. And then Topalov decides to move his king down to d2, trying to get it closer to the center of the board so that the king has more place to move instead of getting checked all the time. Kasparov decides to move his queen to b2, trying to check Topalov's king. Topalov decides to move his king down to d1 this time. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to f1, trying to attack the queen. Now Topalov decides to move his rook down to d2 to try and attack the queen. And then Kasparov decides to try and move his rook to d7 to try and pin Topalov's rook so that it doesn't take the queen. Topalov has no choice but to take the rook and sacrifice his queen in the process. Topalov decides to take back with the pawn, but by doing so, he left his rook on h8 completely vulnerable, and so Kasparov took advantage. Topalov decides to move his rook down to d3. At this point, Topalov is just trying to last as long as he can. Kasparov decides to move his queen all the way to a8, and Topalov decides to try and push his pawn down to c3. At this point, promoting his pawn is pretty much the only chance Topalov has. Kasparov decides to move his queen down to a4 and check the king, and Topalov decides to move his king to e1. And now Kasparov decides to move the pawn to f4, creating a nice little pawn chain. Topalov creates a little pawn chain of his own by moving his pawn to f5. Kasparov decides to get his king into the action by moving it to c1. Topalov decides to move his rook down to d2 to try and give his pawn some more protection when he moves it down. And then Kasparov decides to move his queen to a7, trying to threaten checkmate by moving his queen down to g1. And at this point, Topalov decided to resign. I hope you found this chess match interesting, and please let me know if there are any other chess matches you'd like to see. Bye for now.